One of the quirkiest and yet fondly remembered, as well as the most critically heralded of Image's earliest releases, the Maxx has unfortunately proven as much of a burden to Sam Kieth as a blessing in many ways. In fact, if you were to read what Sam Kieth has to say about the series, you'd probably run screaming in the other direction. From the moment the series started, with great prosperity and somewhat undesired notoriety, also came difficult decisions and long, thankless hours of work. Caught in a dream that would soon become a waking nightmare for the soft-spoken artist, Sam Kieth was on the verge of becoming an icon in modern comics and losing it all in the blink of an eye. As disenfranchised at one point with the Maxx as he may have ever possibly been interested in the character, after years of toiling away on other people's creations, what spurred the aspiring young artist, who by all rights was just starting to really come into his own on his incredibly successful Marvel Comics Presents cover run, which is still heralded as one of the high watermarks of the 90s comic art movement, to completely sever ties with that company and get in bed with their competition overnight. And why does Sam Kieth seem to dislike the Maxx so much? Join me tonight as we continue our multi-part examination of Kieth's career and a little tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia and another one of comics' greatest stories never told, How the Maxx Broke Sam Kieth Part 2, The Nightmare of Success. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, do me a favor and hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. And if you really enjoy what you see, make sure you hug smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page, make a donation via Ko-Fi, pick up a shirt, or use the join button to sign up for membership right here on YouTube. But now, let's get into it. While there are definitely some insane fights, amazing splash pages, and more than a fair share of dangling plot threads that are left lingering even after you've ravenously devoured the Maxx, the thing that will stick with you long after you've read it is the deeply personal storytelling. It might have masqueraded as a superhero book for a few issues, and William Messner-Loebs might not have gotten the memo for a while, but the Maxx was never a superhero book. What makes the book so special are the tales of people and relationships, specifically the way that Sam Kieth so easily and deftly deals with subjects like mortality, sexuality, body positivity, depression, and I could go on and on. He might not have been the deepest guy out there, and he was never trying to rub your face in his politics or his beliefs, but the Maxx laughed at the perceived normalities of the industry and society and just the rest of the world in a lot of ways. Sam Kieth seemed to be going through a time in his life where he was asking a lot of fundamental questions about his life, and this was reflected throughout the book. Because of this, despite the lack of planning, and perhaps in spite of his own distaste for the series, Sam Kieth's brilliance didn't simply stop at the drawing board. It instead extended to channeling his deepest and most personal thoughts in order to create a book unlike anything that anyone who happened to randomly pick it up off of the stands in March of 1993 had likely ever seen. While it would take a while for the book to hit its stride in this department, the fact Sam Kieth was so successful at this type of storytelling is kind of frustrating, because his growing need to tell, quote, deeper, more personal stories happens to be one of the major reasons he cited for so desperately needing to go and do other books. While it might have taken a while to overtake the narrative going into the book, it seems Sam Kieth was fighting his urge to tell those deeper, more emotional and character-driven stories as opposed to two guys punching each other for a bunch of pages from the very beginning. While these elements would eventually go on to be the bedrocks of what most people associate with the series, when he started it, Sam Kieth was well aware of what most Image Comics readers wanted, or at least in his estimation, and that was not people standing around talking about feminism in a comic book. They wanted to see carnage and destruction and great art. And for his part, Sam Kieth did his best to give people what they wanted as much as his mind would allow when the book first launched. Around the time the first issue was released, Sam Kieth went so far as to say, quote, I think as long as two people physically hurt each other, there's enormous possibility for acceptance among kids. And continued, quote, after issue 1, there's going to be a lot more opportunity for action. Make no mistake, I promise there's going to be a lot of action. Just hang in there after number 1. Despite that he might have made some dangling promises of stereotypical superhero action fodder for those happening on his comics by accident, it never felt like Sam Kieth had any real intention of following through on this, not because he didn't want to. I think he wanted to sell comic books, and he tried a few times to sate people's desire for this kind of material in the Maxx. The big reason I don't think he could do it is because it honestly feels like Sam Kieth is not capable of applying himself in any kind of significant way to work that does not speak to him on a personal level for an extended amount of time. Now, this might sound weird to some people, but you have to remember that the guy who's writing Silver Surfer not only probably isn't the biggest fan of that character, he might actually hate the Silver Surfer. But comics are a profession, and as a professional, you work on what you're hired to do, and that rarely aligns with the characters and titles you're working on in a lasting or significant way for a lot of people insofar as what they like in the industry. Sam Kieth had tried to do this in the past with Sandman, with Marvel Comics Presents. It hadn't panned out for him though, and by the time the Maxx launched, it really felt like Sam Kieth was just looking for an opportunity to pour himself out on the page. The Maxx was, if nothing else, the perfect place for that sort of wish. And if there's one thing I've learned about Sam Kieth during all my research, it's that he's definitely not a violent guy. I think Sam Kieth writes about what he knows and what he likes, and fighting just isn't a big part of that, and violence is not a big part of that. Apparently someone didn't bother to mention that to William Messner-Loebs, though. In a commentary track for the Maxx DVD set, Sam Kieth recalled William Messner-Loebs used to say, quote, can't the Maxx beat somebody up? Can't he save somebody? And I'd say, no. He'll sit around and it's in a dark room and he's really sad. And he'd say, but that's not a superhero. And William Messner-Loebs was right. The Maxx wasn't a superhero book. It was something else entirely. But what's interesting is William Messner-Loebs didn't quite get that. That's one of the magical ingredients happening here. There's this veteran writer who's working on all these massive characters and their endlessly confusing continuity on mythic, enormous properties. And he's coming at this like it's a superhero book. He's writing a supervillain and he's being grandiose and his dialogue is quippy and funny and kind of worms its way into your brain until you're just repeating Cheers jokes and eventually you remember years later you didn't even like that show. It was just the Maxx and William Messner-Loebs' genius dialogue. On the other hand, you have Sam Kieth, who's, quote, just pulling monkeys out of his ass, with no thought about what's going to happen in the future. There's no concept of just how long he's going to have to ride this series and this character and how big it's going to go over with people. He's just pulling stuff off of the shelf, dusting it off, and then trying to stick his stories about real life in there. People, relationships, fears, hopes, ambitions, dreams. Sam Kieth wanted to tell stories about a lot of stuff, but not a lot of that stuff was what people normally associated with the superhero genre. I feel like in a lot of ways, Sam Kieth thought he was pulling a fast one on people and eventually started to feel a little guilty about this. To Sam Kieth, the Maxx was this book pretending to be a superhero book, when it was anything but. While this is true to an extent, I don't think a lot of people that stuck with the series past the initial dozen offerings or so were showing up to see the Maxx beat up Mr. Gone. That's just not what the Maxx was ever about. And Sam Kieth seems to have felt like a lot of people who were reading the book only wanted that, and nothing else was acceptable with the series. Ironically, sitting on the shelf next to those books whose main promise was action, gore, TNA, or a combination of the three, the Maxx wasn't any of those things. It wasn't even a superhero book, and while Sam Kieth might later describe this as his book being, quote, weird, What he really seems to have meant was it wasn't a superhero book, and it was just a book about people and life and relationships and the stuff that happens in between birth and death, and Sam Kieth was right. The Maxx did stick out on the spinner rack like a sore thumb, but in all the right ways. Despite his promise of action, the further the series continued, the more cerebral and open-minded it became, and at one point completely dismissed the original main characters, shifting focus and moving forward in time 10 years. And honestly, a lot of us didn't bat an eye. We were just like, oh, okay, this is where we're going now? Cool. Because that's just how the Maxx and Sam Kieth do. The second storyline would shift focus from the relationship between Dave and Julie to Sarah and her father, the no longer deceased and also now reformed serial murderer and rapist, Mr. Gone. At the exact same time this took place in the comic, Sam Kieth was talking to his estranged father for the first time in several years in real life. The lines between fantasy and reality are always blurry, but with Sam Kieth, sometimes they're almost non-existent. I am telling you, if you know about Sam Kieth and his life, the stories in the Maxx feel like just about some of the most personal stories I've ever seen in a mainstream book, and almost without a doubt in a so-called, quote, superhero book. It's facts like these that make it so clear in retrospect that when Sam Kieth talked about wanting to do more personal stories, I think what he really meant after a certain point was any story that didn't have the freaking Maxx in it. In a lot of ways, this was why Sarah became so important. After her debut in the 4th issue, Sarah proved to be an extremely integral part of the Maxx, going on to become a vehicle for Sam Kieth to actually start developing his own solo writing chops, as well as get into some of the more heady and abstract aspects of the Maxx. What's particularly interesting about this is that Sarah was the source of the only disagreement that William Messner-Loebs ever had with Sam Kieth that I'm aware of in their 20-plus year working relationship. When I was interviewing William Messner-Loebs, he shared an extraordinarily interesting story with me. According to William Messner-Loebs, he and Sam Kieth were discussing the plot to issue 4, which introduces and revolves around the teenaged Sarah. Sarah is a depressed and unpopular high school kid who doesn't have too many friends, and the issue explains that her father, who it turns out is Mr. Gone, took a rifle to work, killed his boss and everyone else at the office, and then shot himself. Sarah's left with a deep hatred of Mr. Gone and a lot of anger. Along with the anger, though, she also has a growing desire to be like him that she does not quite understand. She's teetering on the verge of insanity, just completely going nuts. And when she sees the Maxx kill a couple of Is, which literally transform in front of her, understandably, this sends her completely over the edge. She pulls out a gun, puts it to her head, and then nothing. She just can't do it. She doesn't know why she can't do it, but she can't do it. There's something stopping her that she can't quite put her finger on, but it's just enough to make her step back and realize that it isn't the answer that she's looking for. As someone at just the right age who got picked on and bullied in school and didn't have money and did feel hopeless and suicidal at points, there was something that rang true about this issue. She doesn't have some, quote, cathartic revelation at the end of the story, as Sarah puts it. She doesn't even really know why she has to go on other than she should, and it's just kind of what she has to do to survive, to learn, to grow, to do all these important things, but things that take time. Something that she will have none of if she kills herself. That's all in the last 1.5 pages, though. Throughout the other 18 pages, there's a very real sense that she's actually going to pull the trigger and just blow out her brains at the end of the story. In fact, the entire issue seems to be leading up to it in a lot of ways. The ending is so succinct and so perfect, so well conceived and executed. It was shocking to learn this had been the disagreement that Sam Kieth and William Messner-Loebs had. Apparently, Sam Kieth actually did write the issue with the intention of having Sarah kill herself at the end. William Messner-Loebs, however, well, to say he objected to the story in every way conceivable would be putting it lightly. According to our interview, William Messner-Loebs initially tried to convince Sam Kieth to not do it from the moment he brought it up. Messner-Loebs was not comfortable with someone committing suicide, especially someone young, like the potential readers picking up the book. Apparently, there were people telling Sam Kieth, though, you have to do something shocking and crazy in your book, or people aren't going to buy it. And despite literally inventing a character with the express purpose of having her kill herself at the end of the story for shock value, Sam Kieth inadvertently conceived this really powerful suicide story. And that in and itself is incredibly interesting to me. He was going to write and put out a book about teen suicide on the newsstands in 1993. I don't mean this in a negative way. I just think this is another example of how Sam Kieth was going to tell the stories he wanted to tell, not anyone else. I don't think this was anything at all like what these other people had in mind when they suggested that Sam Kieth do something shocking in his book. To the nebulous masses, that was some boobs in a panel or some excessive blood during a 10-page fist fight. For Sam Kieth, it was the self-immolation of a human life, a character literally being torn apart and eventually driven to destroy herself due to forces completely out of her control, all played out before the unsuspecting eyes of tens of thousands of readers, some of which would have been children. I think if he had to do something shocking, he wanted to do something personal and meaningful. I don't think for a second that Sam Kieth would even be capable of marginalizing a subject like suicide, which makes the matter all the more interesting to me. When he approached William Messner-Loebs about it, though, he would have absolutely no part in it. William Messner-Loebs told me he knew they weren't on the same level as some of the musicians and the celebrities who were dying and overdosing and committing suicide, which seemed to be just proliferating the news in his eyes, but that even if they only reached a fraction of that audience, William Messner-Loebs did not care. He wasn't quitting or anything. He would keep helping Sam Kieth with the series, but William Messner-Loebs would not write dialogue for a story about a young girl killing herself. Quote, if Sam Kieth wanted to tell that story, then Sam Kieth could write it then. That's how he put it when I spoke to him. And that's exactly what he told Sam Kieth at the time as well, apparently. William Messner-Loebs argued they had a responsibility to not give in to peer pressure and to tell a story like that for literal shock value. He argued they could make something much more interesting and meaningful out of Sarah not committing suicide. Thankfully for anyone who's read the series before, Kieth finally gave in to Messner-Loebs' repeated demands that they take out the actual suicide at the end of the book. It's one of those rare moments where I think the guy writing the superhero book and the guy writing the deeply personal journal entry that is masquerading as a superhero in bright purple pajamas and a lampshade collided. I doubt one or the other could really figure out why they each seemed so adamant on the point that it happened or not happen. It's perhaps the single most polarizing moment in the entire series for me, and I've never heard it mentioned anywhere before our interview. If Sam Kieth had gone through with the decision, there's literally no telling what kind of book the Maxx would have become. I don't mean the controversy it could have caused or even the toll it might have taken on the relationship between Sam Kieth and William Messner-Loebs. Sam Kieth would have lost one of his central cast members for the last 14 issues of his series, while the two old friends may have been at times writing two vastly different books with the same title. It was this intimately dichotomous relationship that produced the genius of the Maxx. As the months went on and the series continued, the Maxx found its fan base for the first time. Following the initial first few issues where people were already having discussions about body positivity and feminism in the letter sections, after the fourth issue, the Maxx seems to have really connected with readers in a way that very few books ever have. The Maxx's letter section, or Maxx Tracks as it would come to be called, is the major reason you unfortunately have to shell out the cash for the original image floppies, in my opinion. If you really want to learn about Sam Kieth and the Maxx, you have to read Maxx Tracks. As the weeks and the months pressed on, people in the letter section would not only write back and forth and discuss and talk about things, but they would cultivate a captivating atmosphere of open dialogue and communication in the Maxx Tracks letter section. It's jam-packed with small little details, much like Sam Kieth's blog is today, And if you follow Maxx tracks, you really did have and do have an inside track on what was going on with the series, both from fans' perspectives and Sam Kieth's. During the height of the fever pitch of the speculators' boom in the 1990s, the Maxx was beginning to cultivate the loyal readership which would carry the series for more than 5 years. I'm not alone in thinking Maxx Tracks was important either. Sam Kieth himself has said in a few interviews he actually pushed for the letter section to be collected and reprinted as a set of 2 trade paperbacks when they were working on the Maximize series. As far as the original run goes, there was a number of things that make Maxx Tracks so unique and important to the Maxx. While the insane height of the speculators boom was going on, the internet was really starting to be everywhere as well. As email quickly became the hip way of communicating, with the rise of the internet sensation, Sam Kieth did his best to embrace the future, and this led to the eventual creation of an official Maxx news group. With the news group especially, there was an almost unparalleled level of fan involvement and interaction I would never have guessed at, considering how critically Sam Kieth looks at his own work. Not only do some of the letters really illuminate what people took away from the series, but in a few cases, I think they actually played integral parts in Kieth's decision-making process and even the story itself. Being in front of people and dealing with fans is a lot for Sam Kieth, putting it mildly. In 2013, he said that he actually had to take several months off of work after doing the Samplings and Dabblings art exhibition because dealing with people had just taken so much out of him. This isn't because he doesn't like his fans, though. Quite the opposite, I think. He really does seem to love every single person who takes an interest in his stuff. As rarely as he does conventions these days, there's so many stories of him in the past just going way above and beyond, signing forever and ever, and going out of his way to really try and talk and connect with every single fan that showed up. That's one of the reasons in-person meetings are so hard on Sam Kieth, I think, because he really does care. He's always went out of his way to make you feel like you were part of this family and talk to you and read letters. It was really incredible, actually. It's one of the many things that kept me riveted to his work for so many years, but actually being in front of people, having to deal with conventions and all that crap that came with it, I think those days were over for Sam Kieth by the late 1990s. In the 80s, when he had been a more niche artist, I think trying to interact and talk to people was one thing. By the 90s, though, and with the number of books he was selling, it was bound to bring out the phonies and the fakes. Everyone had their hands out, even if they made it seem like they didn't, and not being able to tell friend from phony, as it were, made things even more difficult for the soft-spoken creator. It was during this period where his career was just starting to really take off, but he wasn't able to handle crowds or fan interactions like he once had, that the Maxx Tracks letter section, and especially the news group that grew out of the letter community, became increasingly important. Not only did it let Sam Kieth interact with his fan base from his own home, but on his own time for the first time as well. This seems to have been something of a revelation for Sam Kieth and allowed him to keep in touch and contact with his fan base, and has played pretty heavily into how his blog has evolved over the past few years, in my opinion. There's also a few fans in particular that almost certainly helped really dial in and fine-tune the story early on. By the 4th issue, there were 2 letters in particular that essentially sum up the series more clearly than even Sam Kieth seemed to be capable of. Another thing which comes up in the letters, and as a long-time letter column reader, yes, I was that nerd growing up, but I always wondered if girls just didn't write into comics, or if they didn't read comics at all, or what. But growing up, comics aimed at a female audience were few and far between, and it wasn't until I found some of my sister's Barbie comics and with her Uncle Scrooge books I was reading that I realized there were actually comics made for people who weren't young, white, adolescent guys. Again, the Maxx was one of the rare exceptions. From the 2nd issue on, there were numerous letters from both men and women having meaningful and interesting discussions about everything from feminism in and outside the Maxx to Sam Kieth's portrayal of body positivity in the form of more realistic female forms, as opposed to most other comics, all pun intended. Positive female body image is definitely something you see come up in the Maxx letter column a lot, and you also have some pretty open talk and acceptance of people who were not straight white males. and this did not sit well with some people. Sam Kieth published a few letters like the one from issue 4 where people were plenty insulting and aggressive. There were also people that came across Kieth's work via Darker Image at the time who were so upset with Sam Kieth, they wrote letters to other books like Fanatics, The Savage Dragon letter page, were a particularly vicious letter called Sam Kieth a pedophile before then likening his art to being molested. Despite what, quote, proud white males might have thought at the time, Sam Kieth was far from pushing any kind of agenda, getting preachy, or rubbing your face in politics with the Maxx. For all of the discussion going on today about comics and their agenda for the Maxx, it really feels like some people just couldn't seem to get over the fact that there was a comic that wasn't necessarily being written and drawn exclusively for the white adolescent male demographic, which is strange. Kieth, who normally really shies from controversy, definitely did not back down from this fight, though. It's actually kind of funny to watch Kieth publish one of these letters and kind of sit back with the popcorn and let other Maxx readers have a crack at them. While he never got preachy, by 1997 the Maxx was featured in issue 24 of the aptly named Gay Comics for anyone who hadn't gotten the memo yet. Again, though, this wasn't about making some grand statement or changing people's minds. He's not glorifying or taking sides, and I don't think there's anything super heavy-handed or offensive in the Maxx. This is despite dealing with some seriously dark topics, but I know a lot of people thought it was going to be just another superhero book and were offended by this in the 90s. Those that weren't, though, were beginning to rally around Sam Kieth and his strange little book. With the help of the community cultivated through Maxx Tracks and the official Maxx news group, Sam Kieth continued to cultivate one of the most legendarily loyal fan bases in comics history. Try as I might, I don't believe that archives of the news group exist in any way, shape, or form. This is beyond sad, as by the time the Maxx ended with issue 35, it was literally being advertised as a way to, quote, hang out with Sam Kieth for free. Because face-to-face interactions are difficult for Sam Kieth, I think that the news group became his preferred method to interact with people and see what they thought of certain ideas and certain things. Eventually, there were even actually comments from the news group that started getting published as letters because Sam Kieth thought they were so pertinent and interesting as well. Sadly, I never really got to read or access any of this information even at the time. There's no way I had enough AOL minutes to read a news group. Unfortunately, as Sam Kieth read comments from some of the most loyal and invested fans on the planet, he was also invariably seeing stuff from the vocal minority that we often see popping up in comment sections today. People who have no other goal in life than to just hurt someone's feelings. A lot of time you can feel the rage when you're reading a comment, and I used to wonder how I could have possibly upset someone so badly. Eventually I realized, while there's plenty of people that find me annoying or plain don't like my videos, they're almost never the people who comment. Those people don't like my stuff, and sometimes they'll post about why, but usually they just hit the dislike button and move on because they have something better to do with their time. The people who leave these lengthy rants about the way I look or sound, you can almost hear people telling you something bad has happened to them. It's not you they're screaming at, it's the world. They're wailing into the void and you just happen to be there. I try to take them with a grain of salt, but I'll remember someone calling me an AIDS-infected, crack-addicted Matthew McConaughey the week after I got out of the hospital for the rest of my life. And I'm a rinky-dink little YouTuber. I can only imagine some of the stuff Sam Kieth was getting by this point. It's a real shame we don't have any record of those news group conversations, because that seems to have been one of the major motivating factors that led Kieth to keep the Maxx around for so long. I'd be very interested to read some of those back and forth with fans, especially. While I don't know how active Sam Kieth was, I do know that the single reason that Maxx Tracks happened to begin with, and I get the feeling that the Maxx stuck around as long as it did as well, was Sam Kieth's wife, Kathy. While Sam Kieth may wonder about the type of people that would enjoy his work, as he has such an inordinately low opinion of himself in a lot of ways, I think, his wife does not. Kathy Kieth is the real reason that Maxx Tracks was such an outstanding letter column, aside from the people actually writing in, of course. She was the one responsible for handling all the fan mail, which she would apparently read aloud to Sam Kieth, as well as transcribing names and locations for the column. While Sam Kieth would begin to become increasingly disillusioned over the next several years, his wife always thought that Maxx fans were, quote, witty and wise and well worth cultivation. Eventually, she even began to type up Sam Kieth's scripts and then proofread the issues when they arrived back from the letterer as well. Kathy was an extremely important part of the reason why the Maxx lasted as long as it did, in my opinion, insofar as both providing Sam Kieth a way to talk to his fan base and get feedback without ever having to leave his house, and handling tasks like typing and proofing the script that you can't trust basically anyone but your most inner circle with. And trust was becoming a big thing with Sam Kieth as 1993 turned to 1994 and the sharks began to circle in the water. Image books were routinely selling more than 1 million copies, fueling the already insane speculators boom that was taking place and causing an unprecedented wave of interest from people looking for merchandising and movie and TV rights. The Topps card set was only the tip of the iceberg when it came to Maxx merchandise in the halcyon days of the book, which is strange considering just how little Maxx merchandise has ever actually come out in the nearly 25 years he's been around at this point. What merchandise that did come out came out almost immediately, though. By the time the Wizard 1/2 issue was released in May of 1993, Sam Kieth was already talking about a possible cartoon being adapted thanks to a production company who was looking to work with Eric Larson on a Savage Dragon cartoon at the time. 3 months later, in August of that same year, however, in issue 4 of the Maxx, they announced what can only be described as a mind-boggling amount of merchandise. The Maximum Sound cassette tape adaptation of the first 3 issues was available for order. The Topps card set was going to be out soon, and the Maxx had spawned one of the extremely few true variant covers from Image Comics at the time, with the glow-in-the-dark cover version of issue 1, which had instantly sold out. Interestingly, following this flood of merchandise, there were a few posters, some prints, the portfolio from Homage, a shirt from Graffiti Designs, and a few other things, but basically anything else that you ever saw the Maxx show up on that was licensed from MTV and not Sam Kieth. While I think that a lot of what could be perceived as a lack of merchandised goods comes from the fact that Sam Kieth signed away rights to certain things when he joined up with MTV. Another reason is the types of business deals he was getting approached with. While the comic industry was attracting an inordinate amount, almost unprecedented amount of attention at the time, this meant a lot of nasty people were crawling out of the woodwork trying to get a piece of the action. Most of the other deals either withered on the vine or simply failed to materialize, and outside of the McFarlane Toys action figure, I'm not aware of much of anything of real substance released merchandise-wise for the Maxx that wasn't announced in that 4th issue. While all of this was initially a good thing, looking back and having done more than 2 years of research, I can unequivocally say this short period and what would transpire as fallout from some of these early business decisions would go on to haunt Sam Kieth, as well as utterly poison the entire experience of what many people still consider today to be not only one of the best Image comics ever released, but comic books, period. While it had relatively little merchandise released, much of that ephemera is highly collectible and sought after at this point. Stuff like the Shocker Toys Maxx figure fetched several $100 on the secondhand market, and there's even mail away exclusives from the Topps set which are extremely valuable as well at this point. Little of the merchandise has achieved the kind of status among fans that Maximum Audio has. An interesting concept even for the saturated market searching for any way to exploit comics at the time. Maximum Audio is an interesting tale all its own actually, and something I was eager to learn more about while working on this series. Certainly one of the most fondly remembered and perfectly strange examples of the Maxx eclectic merchandising choices Maximum Sound was created by a company called Animated Alligator and offered for sale via a mail-away ad in the Maxx #4 in May of 1993. The audio adaptation of the first 3 issues of the Maxx is still one of my favorite pieces of comic book ephemera ever, and besides the cartoon, I think probably the best piece of non-art related Maxx merchandise out there. Maximum Sound was done mainly by one man, Steven Romano. Romano has gone on to become fairly active as a self-publisher of independent comic books, but he also worked on some fairly well-known franchises, including Dark Horse's Phantasm comic adaptation along the way as well. The series was surprisingly interesting, and while I've only read the first issue, I highly recommend checking out the Phantasm comic. If you were a fan of the series, the idea was they had all these stories for possible sequels, and they knew they were never going to happen for budget reasons and a few other reasons. So they decided instead of just tossing them out, they'd get people to illustrate them and release them as comics. Other than being an enormous Phantasm fan, I bring this up for one very important reason. You can see from Romano's output, he's a fan of the medium and a fan of the franchises he works on. He had a few concepts for ways to work with the comic industry and maybe even get his foot in the door, considering that he went on to do his own comics. But there was one idea that stood out to him. Inspired by the old read-along records from when he was a child, Romano thought it would be interesting to bring the concept back but update it for a new generation. Cassette tape technology would make producing and distributing the recording both cheaper and easier. The cassette tape format would also allow them to include virtually as much material as they wanted, as opposed to the fairly limited runtime of an LP. This meant that rather than tiny abridged tales, you could adapt one or even several issues of a comic that made up one or several complete stories and put them on a single tape. While this might not sound revolutionary today, at the time no one was doing anything remotely like this in the comics field. This, despite the dizzying amount of merchandise that was being produced. Romano initially pitched the idea to Marvel, apparently, but after more than a year, he wasn't really any closer to getting the project off of the ground. He did manage to get so far as producing a rough demo version of the first Todd McFarlane issue of Spider-Man, though. The demo, which consists of the first part of the Torment story arc, was never officially released for sale, but I miraculously managed to get a copy. It definitely has a lot in common with Maximum Sound, and you can tell there was a kind of template that Romano had in his head that they were working from going into Maximum Sound. Unfortunately, Steven Romano was trying to get his project off of the ground right around the time the Image Revolution was taking place. It was a tumultuous time of change and upheaval, and as it happened, the only person who had been really championing the project at Marvel, Jim Salicrup, left his position and was no longer there to advocate for it. While Steven Romano very well could have ended up right back where he started, apparently he and Salicrup got along pretty well, and before he took off, Salicrup got out his trusty Rolodex and busted out the contact information for a few of the Image founders before they parted ways. With contact info in hand, Steven Romano decided to follow the Image founding fathers from Marvel in hopes there was a little less red tape and bureaucratic nonsense when trying to adapt their original material. Following the top-tier talent from Marvel, Steven Romano started trying to pitch the cassette tape adaptation to people at Image, but guys like Todd McFarlane just had too many people around them for Romano to have his voice heard in the screaming mass of people who were interested in pitching McFarlane ideas and licensing Spawn in general. Eventually, while Steven Romano was working on a deal with Eric Larson to do an adaptation of Savage Dragon, before that project ever came to fruition, he was introduced to Sam Kieth. Apparently, to say Sam Kieth was interested in the project would be the dramatic understatement of the century before anyone really knew what was happening. Steven Romano and Sam Kieth had signed a deal. In the time it had taken him to get someone on the phone to speak with him at Marvel, Steven Romano had already signed a deal and was hard at work on what would later become known as Maximum Sound. When you listen to Maximum Sound for the first time today, you're struck with an undeniable sense of almost having heard it already for some reason. This is because the sound design is incredibly close to that of the MTV animated series. While the MTV Oddities series was itself produced on what's considered a shoestring budget in Hollywood, Maximum Sound really was the brainchild and product of Steven Romano and a few other extremely determined friends. While he was way too busy to be super involved with the project, Sam Kieth did send the production team a tape. This tape contained samples of what he thought the Is might sound like and a bunch of old music and sound cues culled from his record collection to give them an idea of what he thought the flow and feel should be like as far as soundtrack and sound design. The tape also had some rough notes and suggestions about stuff, but Kieth was in the throes of a monthly series and had his hands full to say the least. He most certainly trusted Romano and his crew to get the job done and left them to their own devices, saying at one point, quote, "You guys know what you're doing, you're pros, and I'm an amateur and do not. So I shall leave this to you." While the end product is definitely entertaining to say the least, I think Sam Kieth and perhaps even Steven Romano may have overestimated his and the team's talents when it came to the production side of things. One reason I say this is the fact that it turns out Maximum Sound was actually recorded twice. Now, to be fair, this was apparently for two reasons, though. Originally, Steven Romano and company recorded part of the dialogue at an Austin, Texas studio with plans to record more at another studio at a later date. The acoustics proved so bad that the sessions were unusable, though, and they had to start all over again. Rather than let the bad audio go to complete waste, Steven Romano recorded some other rough takes with the rest of the crew, cut it together, and took the audio to Sam Kieth to let him hear what they had come up with. The audio quality wasn't the only thing that wasn't up to Sam Kieth's standards, though, apparently. It was deemed at that point the original voice of Mr. Gone was, quote, too campy in Kieth's words, and the role was subsequently filled by Romano's father, Rock Romano. While Kieth was pleased enough with her performance, the original voice of Julie Winters was also subsequently recast for the final released version of Maximum Sound. Apparently, this was because Amy McCormick, who was supposed to retain her role as Julie, didn't show up for the recording session, as she was reportedly busy at a Beastie Boys concert. Aaron Latour was then cast in the role of Julie Winters after having initially tried out for the part of Glory in issue 1. Steven Romano coincidentally played the Maxx under his pen name Alistair Slowkill, and if you listen to Steven Romano's voice acting especially, it's not hard to start almost hearing Michael Haley, the voice actor from the cartoon, in your head. While Michael Haley was a more experienced and all told better Maxx, it sounds like he's professionally re-recording the template laid out by Romano on Maximum Sound in a lot of ways. The second recording session was held at Rock Romano's Red Shack in Houston, Texas, which you might have correctly guessed belongs to Steven Romano's father, and the replacement voice actor for Mr. Gone, Rock Romano. The dialogue, soundtrack, and sound effects were all recorded using an analog 16-track reel-to-reel machine run to digital, making some of the sound effects and audio processing used a serious pain. Despite a limited budget and a number of other constraints, Romano insisted that every character have a different voice actor, even characters that only had one or two lines, and all told, the voice acting for Maximum Sound is actually pretty decent. Sam Kieth liked it enough, he took out a full-page ad in the Comic Buyer's Guide to promote its release, if that tells you anything. Released in 1993 and available only from a mail-away ad in the pages of the Maxx, Maximum Sound is definitely worth seeking out if you're a fan of the series. Apparently, though, the original tapes are becoming kind of scarce as the years pass and are something of a collector's item at this point. If you're just interested in checking it out, which I highly recommend, it can actually be downloaded totally legally and for free from archive.org, and I'll make sure to have a link to that in the description below. After its initial release in the Maximum Newsflash info sheet that went out with the original copies of the Maximum Sound cassette, Steven Romano talks about the insanely positive response that they've experienced. There were free copies of the glow-in-the-dark issue with the initial 2,500 orders, and those were gone in 5 days. The tape was so successful that they rushed it back into production, resulting in the two different inserts that you see. They literally ran out of the inserts that they had decided to go with and ended up using the other versions to fill the initial orders. This should attest to just how popular Maximum Sound was when it was released and how much of a surprise this fact was to everyone involved. In the newsflash letter, they also talk about two things I'm really bummed never happened. First, they were going to extend the adaptation to include the next 3 issues, and second, they were going to re-release the entire thing on CD with improved mixing and mastering. Better mixing and better mastering would have gone a long way in improving Maximum Sound, and it's kind of sad that this went south so quickly we never got to see this expanded and upgraded version of the project, in my opinion. What they do mention and did end up happening, though, was an adaptation of Jim Valentino's Shadowhawk. The experience was not pleasant for anyone involved, to put it mildly. Apparently, however, while it did come out, and Steven Romano still initially hoped that it would be the second in a series of similar planned projects, the Shadowhawk adaptation did not go over like Maximum Sound did. Animated Alligator, wary of how they had under-anticipated the reaction to Maximum Sound, invested too heavily in the project and took a beating. They would soon shutter their doors, and the core group moved on to other things, most of them outside of the industry. Steve Romano did leave the industry for a period, but he's not only come back to comics in more recent years with his independently published works, he even produced another soundtrack adaptation, this time for his own original work, Wasteland 1989, released on CD instead. For its part, Maximum Sound still remains one of the most influential, interesting, and undeniably unique projects from a period absolutely littered with nearly every possible gimmick and trick one could begin to conceive of dealing with comics. With Animated Alligator dissolved more than 25 years ago, as well as several other mitigating circumstances, sadly, I can say with 100% certainty, we will never see Maximum Sound officially released ever again. While it certainly isn't perfect, this is a shame because I, for one, really enjoy it for what it is. While Sam Kieth most definitely was not heavily involved with the production in any kind of significant way, he did, as I mentioned, send Steven Romano and his camp a tape of suggested sounds for stuff like The Is, as well as musical recommendations, which mostly consisted of bootleg Frank Zappa and Todd Rundgren recordings to simulate how the music should feel and what it should sound like. I'd heard about this tape a few times over the years, but I'd never even seen one, let alone heard one, and I wasn't entirely sure what was actually on it or if it actually existed until recently. The Torment Demo tape, as it's called, is the actual entire tape that Sam Kieth sent Steven Romano uncut and unedited on one side, and the Spider-Man Torment Demo that Steven Romano produced for Marvel on the other. Incredibly, these tapes were apparently given away as prizes to an extremely lucky few who won a contest centered around the release of Maximum Sound. The contest itself was, as far as I know, for deciphering what curse words the Maxx was uttering in a certain part of the Maximum Sound recording. By utilizing digital technology, though, which Romano had never considered, a lot of people figured out that it was just Son of a Bitch played backwards. I guess there were actually so many winners, they ended up giving away signed comics at one point instead because they ran out of tapes pretty quick. Some of the extremely early contestants apparently did end up getting these Torment Demo tapes, though I have no clue how few of these actually made it into the hands of fans. One of these early winners who actually did get the Torment Demo tape and who has held on to the tape lovingly for all of these years graciously made me a digital copy of the contents so I could share details here with you all, though. Thank you again, Stephen Toms. We owe you a debt of gratitude for not only holding on to this incredible piece of Maxx history, but sharing its contents. It's people like you that help make these episodes possible. I've long wondered about the similarities between Maximum Sound and the MTV animated cartoon, so it was an eye-opening experience getting not only read some of the copious notes that Steven Romano shared about the project, but eventually speak with the man himself, who graciously took time to answer my copious questions about the project, much of which is what I've shared with you all. Getting to listen to the Torment Demo tape, however, proved to be perhaps the most illuminating part of researching this particular piece of Maxx merchandise. Incredibly, the demo tape is rather pivotal when trying to understand Sam Kieth's entire approach to the Maxx. The demo tape makes it very clear that Sam Kieth had an extremely clear and defined version of what the series should sound and feel like. Sam Kieth was also involved with the sound production for the Oddities cartoon and actually talked about it in a few interviews I came across, complaining about the fact he never wanted to hear someone talking about how wet and dark it was ever again. Sam Kieth was also heavily involved with the music used in the production, particularly the Oddities adaptation as well, so it's interesting to know he already had such a well-conceptualized version of what the world would look and sound like when adapted for any number of mediums at this point. All this despite the fact that the comic was still kind of defining itself and really figuring out what it was all about around this time. Sam Kieth even had a solid understanding of what the characters themselves should sound like when looking for voice talent. According to Stephen Romano, Sam Kieth gave these instructions and descriptions of the main characters to him during discussions prior to producing the first cut, and then after having heard the first unused recording session with the alternate voice cast. Quote, "The Maxx, he's got to sound tough and sort of mean, but kind of cool too. Maybe sort of like a lost cartoon character with gravel in his throat or something. Julie, she's a lost soul, but you should never be able to tell that just from her voice. She has to be tough and sort of matter of fact in the real world. Mr. Gone, he can't be the classic cackling Magneto type villain. He's got to be slow and sinister with his delivery, real understated with some Twin Peaks type jazz music in the background whenever he shows up. Also with Mr. Gone, he has a screwed up speech bubble, so I think there should be some bizarre sort of effect on his voice, like backwards reverb or something." Together, the Sam Kieth section of the Torment Demo tape and this Maximum newsletter information make it clear that one of the main reasons Maximum Sound and the MTV Oddities cartoon sound so uncannily similar is that Sam Kieth had a well-developed and defined sense of what the Maxx should feel and sound like. The other thing that this tape especially brings into focus is Sam Kieth's repeated reference to the music of both Twin Peaks and Frank Zappa. I know what you're thinking. Oh God, he's going to talk about Frank Zappa, but just hear me out. I swear this is actually really interesting. I've long known that Sam Kieth was a Frank Zappa fan, but I found out two very interesting things about just how into Frank Zappa he is while researching this documentary. First, according to Neil Gaiman, at one point, a viewer of the channel attended a speech where Gaiman told a story about Sam Kieth at the height of his unhappiness on Sandman and his utter sense of disillusionment following his being forced to redraw the entire first issue, where he asked that his name be removed entirely from the series with his credits to read Uncle Meat instead. Uncle Meat was an album released by Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention in 1969, which was the soundtrack to a supposed science fiction film. I've never been clear if the entire film was just a farce performance piece thing that Zappa was working as an angle, or if he actually had aspirations of getting a movie out, but it never happened. Either way, if you listen to Uncle Meat, while, as per usual, its bizarre concoctions that sound like a lot of Frank Zappa, the album is specifically centered around shifts between predominantly jazz, rock, and orchestral music. Sam Kieth specifically references Zappa's ability to turn and change on a dime as being a big part of the Maxx as well. The main musical notes from the Maxx had apparently always been envisioned as rather smoking jazz interjected with sporadic sounds of excitement or despair. The second thing that I found out about was Sam Kieth had been constantly slipping Frank Zappa into his comics for years by the time the Maxx started. In an interview he did with Don Chin in 1992, just prior to really blowing up and launching the Maxx, Sam Kieth discussed the details of his work for Don Chin, who gave Sam Kieth his first professional penciling work in the industry. I talked more about Sam Kieth's work on Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters in the previous episode, so check that out if you want to learn more about that. And if you really want to learn about Sam Kieth and his work for Don Chin on not only Radioactive Black Belt Hamsters, but also his parody press books, which he did some mind-blowing covers for, I'll stick a link to that Don Chin interview that I did in the description below as well. In Chin's own interview with Kieth that he did for the Death of Clint graphic novel, Sam Kieth explains the appearance of the hamster's villain, Infidel Castro, was directly modeled after Frank Zappa. Infidel Castro first showed up in the story Toe Jam Monsters from Atlantis, which Chin distinctly remembered just letting Sam Kieth have fun and run wild with the designs with in our interview. Sam Kieth doesn't stop there though. In the rarely seen interview, he actually connects Infidel Castro with another character a la his Trout universe. Like how the Maxx's first appearance is actually in Kamiko Primer number 5, he goes on to say, quite candidly, quote, "You know there's a version of that character that's actually going to be a villain in an upcoming Image Comics thing. I've changed around his nose and the way he looks." Sam Kieth is of course referring to none other than Mr. Gone. Trust me, you'll never look at Mr. Gone the same again, and once you see it, you will not be able to unsee it. Sam Kieth is not joking. If trying to swipe one of his album names for his pen name, repeated mentions of his music, sending clips of said music to 2 different production companies, and using his image as a direct model wasn't enough of a Maxx connection, there's also a rather interesting bit that Sam Kieth has shared about how music relates to his artistic process. Sam Kieth has said in interviews that he creates a sort of playlist for himself before going into any given project. He's usually got artists and songs and stuff already in mind when he sits down to work, and he'll assemble them for himself before he starts trying to work. It's apparently the music that motivates him and gets him to actually draw and get inspired. From the Torment Demo tape, I'm guessing Frank Zappa made up a big part of the Maxx playlist. When you listen to Zappa and you read the Maxx, it actually makes a lot of sense. Maybe more sense than Zappa or the Maxx on their own, actually. I find the fact that he references Twin Peaks in conjunction with the Maxx interesting as well. I mean, it is not hard to find a connection there. The Twin Peaks television series had ended only months before, and Fire Walk with Me was possibly still in theaters when Sam Kieth was working on the first issue of the Maxx. While he might not have structured the book or the look of anyone in the comic around or from Twin Peaks or anything, there's a great deal of similarity to be found in the dual nature of people for both series, and Twin Peaks also got pretty heavily into otherworld or alternate universes and other worlds, especially throughout the second season. The first season of Twin Peaks deals with the severe trauma of rape and sexual assault, and the second with basically traveling between another world or dimension. It was never made explicitly clear. I won't go off on a complete tangent about Twin Peaks here, but if you've watched the second season of the show especially, then you'll get what I'm talking about here. Along with the Aboriginal world of the dreaming, it's not hard to imagine these were 2 of the major influences on what would become the crux of the Maxx's initial story arc and the concept of the Outback. While William Messner-Loebs talked about the dreaming in a few interviews, including our own, looking into the production of Maximum Sound was the first time I discovered the Twin Peaks connection, and I thought it was worth sharing as a little aside here. I don't get the feeling Sam Kieth had a lot of time to watch TV around this period, so bringing up Twin Peaks repeatedly was interesting to me for a number of reasons. And speaking of television shows that got canceled way before they should have, the ill-fated MTV Oddities Maxx cartoon series has played an incredibly important role in not only exposing people to the character, but continuing generations to the franchise as well. It's helped make the Maxx one of the most fondly and probably most often rediscovered of the 90s Image Comics creations. These facts are all the more impressive given that the series only lasted 13 episodes, airing from April to June of 1995 as part of MTV's Oddities program block. While I normally don't talk about television or movie adaptations in any kind of depth on the channel, not only does this series deserve every bit of the accolades it receives and more in my opinion, I don't honestly think any discussion of the Maxx or Sam Kieth's career would be complete without getting into it. Not only is the cartoon one of the few things that Sam Kieth looks back on with true and sincere reverence in regards to his career, but when I was digging into the production, I found some interesting stuff that I thought was pertinent to the narrative of this documentary. Unbelievably, a cartoon series was in the talks for the Maxx before the first issue was ever even on the stands. While even today that's impressive, at the time it was unheard of. However, in the opening blurb for the Wizard 1/2 issue, Sam Kieth insanely confirms this fact, saying not only one, but two different companies are eyeing the Maxx for possible development. In the end, neither of those companies wound up being the ones to make the Maxx happen, but that's most certainly for the best. It was only through a series of randomly fortuitous events that Rough Draft, who helmed the animation for the series, and Sam Kieth were given such an incredible amount of creative leeway and artistic freedom on the Maxx. The fact the Maxx got a cartoon to begin with is pretty insane when you think about it. I mean, it deals with some pretty dark subject matter. This makes the faithfulness, integrity, and care with which the property was treated by everyone involved in the production nothing short of unbelievable. Greg Vanzo and his Rough Draft animation studio were interested in directly adapting the Maxx for the small screen. That is, following the comic as closely as possible and only changing or adding stuff when it was absolutely necessary. They were even suggesting using some of Sam Kieth's static images for the production, which must have sounded insane to a lot of people at MTV. Thankfully, Rough Draft was able to do the Maxx cartoon on a relative, quote, shoestring budget, and MTV was undergoing something of an identity crisis, to say the least. At the time, MTV didn't exactly know what they were going to do with the channel anymore. They had some breakout successes with their animation in the early 90s, stemming from Liquid Television specifically. Liquid Television, which consisted of various shorts from different artists and animators, earned a cult following almost immediately. But after the unprecedented popularity of the Beavis and Butthead shorts, they were given their own show, which was a massive success for the company as well. MTV then decided to spin off another series, the story of which is apparently integral to the Maxx's own production. While Peter Chung's Aeon Flux would eventually go on to earn its own half-hour show, initially MTV ordered 6 shorts to air on Liquid Television. These 6 shorts were done so as to comprise one serialized story across the episodes as a whole and not as single episodes. The idea was that you were supposed to watch all of the shorts back to back to get the complete story. MTV, which is rather notorious for their chintzy home video releases, actually followed through and put out a VHS collection of these episodes all back to back, the way they were intended to be seen within the matter of a few months. It was an interesting and fairly unique approach as far as I'm aware in the United States. Interested in exploring the concept further and encouraged by the popularity of both Beavis and Butthead and Aeon Flux, MTV devised their next big experiment in animation: oddities. Virtually anyone you talk to would tell you they remember seeing the Maxx on Liquid Television, but they didn't. It's a Mandela effect. I swear, the Maxx probably could have found a much wider audience over the years, if only through reruns, if it had been on Liquid Television, due probably largely to its 13-minute runtime as well as the serialized nature of the episodes. The Maxx has only ever enjoyed extremely limited reruns on the channel outside of its original airings. Those original airings were part of a block inventively dubbed Oddities. The basic premise of Oddities was that all of the shows would be set up to operate the same way as the Liquid Television Aeon Flux shorts that MTV had commissioned. The episodes would be completely interconnected to tell one singular story and require the viewer to watch the entire season to get anything that was going on. This would allow for 2 important things. The first was for short seasons, which were easy to cancel or continue on a rating basis. The second was that due to the seasons being self-contained as well as fairly short, you could easily swap shows in or out with little trouble. It was a decent enough concept. Unfortunately, though, I don't know if it wasn't promoted right or it just wasn't the right time slot, but Oddities died a quick death. The only other show to ever air under the Oddities banner was the second half of the original 30-minute time slot with the Maxx and another Liquid Television spinoff, The Head. Mystifyingly, while the Oddities program never found its footing, The Head somehow got its own self-titled season with full 30-minute episodes a full year later, before then promptly vanishing shortly thereafter, never to be seen again. It is worth mentioning the concept of the season being one large story was completely abandoned outside of Oddities, though. This means that the concept probably failed, and at the time, stuff like television shows were believed to have a very limited interest when it came to home video, so MTV didn't exactly know what to do with properties like the Maxx, Aeon Flux, and the first season of The Head for years. There are some pretty big questions about how the Maxx actually ended up getting his own series to begin with, though. While MTV was actively seeking out properties, and someone most assuredly was sniffing around Image at the time, Sam Kieth wasn't a founding member, he didn't have record-breaking sales, and more importantly, his character hadn't even been published yet. When I spoke with William Messner-Loebs, he said that while he was fairly insulated from that kind of thing and didn't know a whole lot since Sam Kieth handled all of the licensing and rights and stuff, but William Messner-Loebs felt like Sam Kieth already had a foot in the door animation-wise by the time the Maxx started. This foot probably happens to be Kieth's cousin, famed Cartoon Network animator Dave Feiss, the creator of Cow and Chicken, as well as the spin-off series I Am Weasel. Feiss had been in the cartoon industry for a good long while by the time the Maxx was kicking off in the early 90s, and considering that Dave Feiss ended up basically doing the better part of an issue of the Maxx, as well as contributing the design for the Crap-On in the Hat early on in the Maxx, it's clear the two were fairly close. After a little digging, I found out they had done a story together only a year before in Don Chin's Pummeler book by Parody Press, and while it's fairly well known that Dave Feiss contributed to issue 5 of the Maxx with the Crap-On in the Hat, he also helped ink part of issue 30 in May of 1997. To my amazement, I also discovered that for a period at least, Dave Feiss and Sam Kieth were actually sharing a studio around 1995. I don't know how long this lasted, but I also found an interview where Sam Kieth talked about the fact he was helping Dave Feiss write episodes of Cow and Chicken and I Am Weasel. While his only writing credit that I know of was for the pilot episode of Cow and Chicken, No Smoking, it's funny to think about him helping bang out stories for a kid's cartoon while he was writing, drawing, and working on the grim and gritty world of the Maxx at the same time in 1996 and 1997. This also hints at the fact that Dave Feiss and Sam Kieth likely shared a studio for a good length of time around this period, and I would imagine that's primarily how the two became involved with the other's work. Cartoon Network and Hanna-Barbera are a far cry from MTV though, so I don't know how much help Dave Feiss would have been at making connections there for Sam Kieth. In a rare interview for the DVD release of the Maxx years later, Sam Kieth recalled that Abby Turcoli from MTV, who would go on to be one of the executive producers on the cartoon, called him out of the blue, while in others that he, quote, pursued MTV because he thought it might be a good place to get away with whatever the heck the Maxx was going to turn out like. That, however, seems to be the extent of what he's shared about how the initial deal was made. While there are accounts of Rough Draft owner Greg Vanzo looking to adapt the Maxx himself, this just isn't true. He was a fan of the comic, which is why he jumped at the opportunity to work on the cartoon when it fell into his lap, and make no mistake, that's exactly what happened. Another executive producer on the show, John Andrews, was checking in with Greg Vanzo, whose Rough Draft Korea animation studio was doing a ton of work for MTV and Andrews on Beavis and Butthead at the time, and they started talking about some of the properties that Andrews and MTV had recently acquired. Pleased with the work that Greg Vanzo and Rough Draft were doing for them, when Andrews brought up the Maxx and discovered that Vanzo was a fan, Andrews outright asked him if he was interested in being a part of the series. Vanzo half-jokingly suggested he produce the series to Andrews, who, despite the fact that Greg Vanzo had no episodic television credits to his name at this time, gave him the job somewhat to his astonishment. Now, admittedly, while Greg Vanzo didn't have any production credits, not only had he started Rough Draft Korea with his wife Nikki while working on Ren and Stimpy, But they then went on to work for The Simpsons, which they were still doing when they had then started working on Beavis and Butthead as well. During this period, there was not an inordinately large amount of primetime animation being produced in the United States, and even less of it had the instant recognition and popularity of Ren and Stimpy, The Simpsons, or Beavis and Butthead. It was an impressive resume, to say the least, and given his previous familiarity with the book and proven ability to turn in a decent product on budget and on time, John Andrews gave Greg Vanzo and Rough Draft some money and kind of left them to their own devices for the most part. While the budgetary constraints were obviously a struggle at points, it did come with the upside of an extremely larger degree of creative freedom and control. The less money someone has tied up in a project, the less likely they are to tamper and feel the need to get involved. And this is a good thing because what Greg Vanzo and Rough Draft envisioned for the show was radically different from any other cartoon being produced at the time. When Greg Vanzo put together his team, it turned out he wasn't the only fan of the Maxx. While they might have had differing ideas of how to accomplish it, the one thing they all essentially had in common was the desire to stick to the book as closely as possible. Interestingly, in one of the special features for the DVD release, storyboard artist Seth Kearsley specifically noted that not only did they read the books and want to stay as true to that as possible, but that they did indeed listen to maximum sound. When Kearsley and other members of the crew heard the tape, they were blown away by the fact it was a direct reading of the comics line for line. When Kearsley and Vanzo discovered that maximum sound was word for word and succeeded because it was so much like the comic, not in spite of that fact, it must have made the idea of doing this with the cartoon seem much more achievable as well. Point in fact, Greg Vanzo discovered that they could directly adapt the comic, issue for issue, or at least as closely as possible, time and budget allowing, and not only would it actually not require a lot more preparation or work than normal, it would actually save them some precious time and money. At least with the story. While taking the dialogue and plot almost directly from the comic book eliminated a big chunk of work in the long run for Rough Draft's crew on that end of things, animating the Maxx to look anything like it did in the comics was an entirely different story. Most animators would have taken one look at Sam Kieth's style and either began to think about how to boil it down to as few lines as possible and somehow simplify it, or have gone completely stark raving mad. There's absolutely no way that you could even begin to approximate the level of detail that Sam Kieth put into some of those covers and panels for the early issues of the Maxx with hand-drawn cell-frame animation without spending years on a single scene, if even that is possible. While it was around by 1994 and 1995, computer animation required extremely expensive computers, rendering took forever, and there were few experts in the field at that time. On top of this, computer animation wasn't always as popular as it's become today, having virtually replaced traditional animation altogether at this point. At the time, the first real computer animated film, Toy Story, was still in production and wouldn't be released until a few months after the Maxx had finished airing. While Toy Story would obviously completely change the trajectory of that medium, the Maxx also happens to be a groundbreaking work in computer animation. Rather than rely wholly on computer-generated graphics like Toy Story, however, the Maxx exists on the razor's edge between digital and traditional animation instead. The end goal was to simply more effectively translate the comic pages to the screen. Greg Vanzo realized early on that they wanted to utilize Sam Kieth's original art where and however they could. There was no way they were ever going to get close to approximating Sam Kieth's work on screen, and this technique would allow them to get the cartoon to look as close to the book as possible. Some of what they were talking about hadn't ever really been done though. As a result, Greg Vanzo pioneered early techniques for integrating 2D images with computer animation on the Maxx, some of which are still common practice with digital animation today. Greg Vanzo and Rough Draft were early pioneers introducing computer animation inks to an otherwise static 2D image. This trick solved some rather pesky problems for the production, like, having the characters move and that kind of thing. While doing their initial work on the Maxx, Greg Vanzo and his crew at Rough Draft came up with the rough template for what would become a motion comic in many regards. While they're not remembered inordinately fondly today, the animation on the Maxx can in some ways be compared to the Marvel superheroes cartoons from the late 60s. The Maxx, however, is certainly much more than just a motion comic or those Marvel superhero cartoons. And the production eventually also integrated traditional animation sequences, completely computer-rendered images, and even live-action film shots composited over animation. Even now, more than 25 years later after its release, the Maxx cartoon still looks amazing, and Rough Draft's work on the series is fairly groundbreaking and revolutionary stuff. As Greg Vanzo said in one of the commentary tracks for the DVD, he lives to be told he can't do something, and he heard that a lot while they were working on the Maxx. Despite working on a monthly book, Sam Kieth was intimately involved with several different aspects of production, including at least some of the voice acting sessions. He's also referenced being personally involved with some of the sound design and music departments of the television show, and I know for a fact he was heavily involved with the animation department. Regardless of finding the Maxx through the show or the comic, most images that spring to mind for people are actually Sam Kieth drawings. There was apparently a few times in the show where they had an idea for a shot or they wanted to expand on certain things, and Sam Kieth was integral to that work. In particular, there's a panning shot where they flash back and forth from the Outback to the real world, and you get to see people's Outback counterparts, which are, of course, these strange, bizarre creatures. In the comic, it had only been a splash page, but in the cartoon, they wanted to extend the shot and have it last nearly 2 minutes. To achieve this, they chose to ransack Sam Kieth's sketchbooks rather than try and come up with something on their own to fit Sam Kieth's style. They actually managed to find a city backdrop image they could use, and then they had Sam Kieth come up with several additional creatures for the shot. Working on a monthly book like he was, you would think Sam Kieth would look back and groan about this, but in fact, the Maxx cartoon seems like one of the only things that he's ever achieved that he appears to be able to take actual pleasure in revisiting. When I spoke to William Messner-Loebs, and became apparent during my reading at some point as well, Sam Kieth had always had aspirations to direct and be in films, probably having more than a little to do with Dave Feiss. I know Sam Kieth was interested in animation for a long time, and it seems like a real dream come true for him getting to work on this cartoon. While Sam Kieth was also tapped to write no less than 3 completed drafts of a Maxx live-action film, he was also slated to direct at several points. He said he's actually glad that the movie never happened. What they achieved on the cartoon was really something to behold, and there would be no way, even today, of recapturing the freedom and quality that they were able to achieve on the show. This statement stands in almost literal juxtaposition with just about anything else you will ever hear Sam Kieth make about his own career. Amy Danlis, who played Sarah, appeared on the Dead TV podcast and talked about Sam Kieth greeting everyone and being so excited things were going to happen. He even apparently signed copies of all the books that they were working on and gave them to the cast members as a sign of his appreciation for the work that they were doing. While the cartoon might not even necessarily be your cup of tea, I think it's important to explore it just a little, considering it truly does seem to be one of the few things that Sam Kieth is truly contented with in his long and illustrious career, and I wanted to point that fact out. While extremely selective, it seems like despite the shortcomings of the source material in his own eyes, Sam Kieth was able to look past that and really enjoy this time and the product of all the effort that went into this show. A lot of people's first introductions to the Maxx was through the show. But as I mentioned, despite this, the images, scenes, and even the dialogue that come to mind when they think of it are more often than not directly from the comic. Even today, more than 2 decades later, this is a situation you do not see. While there are more people producing comic book content like movies and cartoons than ever before, being given this amount of freedom and in turn using it to stick as closely as possible to the subject material like this is fantastically rare. Along with the incredible skill and attention to detail that went into the show on every level, this has helped ensure that the Maxx still has a pretty decent cult following more than 25 years later, despite the fact it only aired for 3 months in the 90s on a music television channel and originally only received a rather bizarre and somewhat limited VHS release. When MTV initially decided to release the Maxx on home video around a year later, sometime in 1996, many of us who had seen the show when it aired were kind of shocked and disappointed. Inexplicably, bits of dialogue had been trimmed, and so were a few shorter sequences and scenes, along with a number of musical selections. The major thing, though, was there was an entire episode missing. The entire series had only consisted of 13 12-minute episodes. Of those 12 minutes, almost 2 or 3 of that was comprised of the opening titles and closing credits. When you cut all of that out, you're left with just a little over 2 hours worth of material. I think about 2 hours and 15 minutes, give or take. Consequently, the VHS, which lists the runtime as, quote, approximately 2 hours, sounds right when you're looking at it. Although, looking back, the fact a professionally released tape said approximately on it should have been an indicator something wasn't quite right. Considering just how precious little of the Maxx cartoon you had to begin with, the omission of certain scenes along with an entire episode left a gaping hole in the release for fans of the series and the comic for years. The release was a major disappointment at the time, but it was all you could get unless you happened to trade for VHS copies of someone who'd managed to tape it when it originally aired on MTV, or bought one of the horrendously marked up bootlegs that used to be everywhere almost immediately once DVDs hit the market. To this day, I honestly still have no clue why episode 7 is missing. For years, rumors circulated that the episode had been cut due to rights having to do with Erik Larsen's Savage Dragon, as well as one of his villains, Mako, that Sam Kieth had incorporated into the 6th issue of the Maxx. As issues were being translated one issue to one episode, this might have been the case had Savage Dragon or Mako ever showed up in the cartoon, but they didn't. This, however, doesn't mean the production didn't have a massive problem on their hands at the time, though. While team-ups and crossovers between early Image books were all the rage among several of the founding fathers, as well as fans at the time, what's kind of funny is Jim Lee specifically avoided doing this very often, especially when it came to important plot points or anything that might play an important or pivotal role in a title for a very specific reason. He was well aware of the pitfalls that could occur if he ever wanted to adapt the material into a cartoon or a movie, or even if he just wanted to eventually reprint the stories somewhere else. While they all got along at the time they were working on these stories, Lee urged caution when it came to crossovers to anyone who would listen. Unfortunately, it seems like an exceedingly small circle paid any attention. Despite what I can only assume were repeated warnings, Savage Dragon and Mako had rather inexplicably made an appearance in issue 6 of the Maxx, followed completely needlessly and utterly confusingly by Dale Keown's Pit in issue 7 and 8. While Lee was looking at hypotheticals from his future, Sam Kieth found himself exactly where Jim Lee always feared he might be in 10 years' time, trying to either license the rights to other creators' characters or dance around them and their part of the plot elements for an adaptation. Since the cartoon was, in Sam's words, for better or worse, refusing to deviate from the book, these appearances by Savage Dragon, Mako, and Pit were a big problem. While they might have been able to get the rights to Pit from Dale Keown, Savage Dragon was slated to start airing in his own cartoon less than 6 months later on an entirely different station, and was being produced by an entirely different studio. The rumors I've heard of them getting so far as auditioning people for the role of Savage Dragon are totally false. Sam Kieth and Greg Vanzo both knew that there was an upcoming Savage Dragon cartoon, and this would have made the rights a nightmare. While Savage Dragon's appearance had been nominal in the book anyways, getting around his cameo appearance wasn't so much a problem. Getting around the villain who had appeared in full throughout the story, Mako, on the other hand, was going to be something of a headache. Because Sam Kieth always felt that people wanted a, quote, more traditional comic book, he would randomly throw stuff into the book to try and appease those people from time to time. Issue 6 is probably the most notorious of these happenings, to say the least. Sam Kieth thought there were a lot of people who might not necessarily be very interested in the more introspective and perhaps even, dare I say, intellectual aspects of the book, stating at one point, quote, "I think as long as two people physically hurt each other, there's enormous possibility for acceptance among kids." So when he did his Savage Dragon crossover, he only showed up in a few panels and was fairly inconsequential to the story, being more of just a cop than a superhero or anything. Mako, however, was the entire centerpiece. Truth be told, Mako had been the reason that Sam Kieth had done the Savage Dragon crossover, from what I can tell. Not wanting to waste his time coming up with a disposable villain, a concept which wouldn't necessarily fit the Maxx anyways, Sam Kieth had opted to not only cash in on the popularity of crossovers, which were super hot at the time, but also save himself the headache of coming up with something both disposable and original. Issue 6 of the Maxx consists of essentially one protracted fight scene between Mako, this psychotic half-man, half-shark creature who's been hired to kill him, and the Maxx, who's accidentally superglued his spikes to his palms. Mako knocks the Maxx around a bunch until the Maxx manages to get the glue off of his hands and his spikes free. They tussle a little bit, and then they get caught in this massive gas main explosion. You never really get to see the Maxx throw down with this actual supervillain Mako, and he spends a lot of the issue running away. As much as I think he might have wanted to prove otherwise, the issue demonstrated very effectively the Maxx was not a superhero. Sam Kieth might have done his best to dance around it, but that's just not what the Maxx was about. This made the dilemma of what to do about Mako in the cartoon doubly difficult. The Savage Dragon was easy enough to replace with just another random cop, but replacing Mako would require Sam Kieth to do what he had so desperately wanted to avoid in the first place: come up with a completely disposable and original supervillain for a book that didn't really even have a superhero. According to the Maxx DVD commentary in 2009, Sam Kieth decided to change Mako into a hammerhead, which was the farthest thing away from a Mako that he could think of shark-wise. He then called up Eric Larson to make sure that he wasn't going to, quote, sue our asses. Larson was not interested in suing, but that phone call probably precipitated the decision regarding Pitt. While the Mako fight scene at least had some point to it, the Pitt appearance in not one but two issues isn't just needless, it's weird. The Pitt randomly shows up in the Outback for absolutely no reason. The Maxx and Pitt fight, then an issue later, when the plot from the previous two issues is over, Pitt's gone again with no explanation as to exactly what the hell just happened. Pitt is so inconsequential to the story, and so much as he literally could have been anyone, that Sam Kieth and Greg Vanzo opted to just replace him with a random Iz, which actually makes a lot more sense than Pitt showing up when you sit down and think about it. At least I think. But all the rights issues aside, I still have yet to figure out why they cut that episode for the VHS. I know there were some problems with music rights, but nothing that would necessitate cutting an entire episode. After decades of fans demanding a proper release, the Maxx mysteriously began to pop up on certain streaming services throughout 2007 and 2008. Not long after that, in early 2009, there was an on-demand DVD release for the series announced through Amazon. Much to many people's surprise, not only were there no snags or hang-ups, but the set boasted special features including interviews and commentary with none other than Sam the Man Kieth himself. While Sam Kieth is only in a painfully small section of the 20-minute interview bonus features, he's thankfully featured on all 13 commentary tracks for the episodes. Whether it's because he feels like he's among friends and more comfortable, or that he feels like he's with people he doesn't see as leering fanboys, I don't honestly know, but he really opens up about the Maxx on those commentary tracks. Sam Kieth talks about a lot of what happened with the series, what he was thinking, how he was feeling when he was doing it, and eventually why he chose to bring it to such an untimely end in a lot of people's eyes. To answer the latter question, unfortunately, we have to talk about one aspect of Sam Kieth's career that he, as well as everyone else involved, would rather be swept under the rug. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I know this has been a long time coming. I have a few other Sam Kieth related videos, but I thought I owed it to you all to finally get this done. I hope it was worth the wait and you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If Patreon is not your thing, but you still want to support the channel, have no fear. After 2 years, I can finally offer memberships right here on YouTube. Just click the little join button and make sure you select the tier and perks that fit you best. You can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below as well. If that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. This video was made possible by the Jerk Broadcasting Service as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I'd like to seriously thank every single one of you who has chosen to support the channel this year. I think the quality of the videos has really been improving, and I just hope I'm doing you all proud. Thank you to every single one of you that chooses to support this channel. I couldn't do these videos without your help, and it means the world to me, and I have some big plans for this upcoming year, so keep an eye on the channel, and thank you again from the bottom of my heart. I hope this series has been worth the wait. This has been the channel that the Maxx and Image built, so thank you all for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops, and keep reading comics.